Oxford's cold in February, it turns out, especially when you have to park several miles out to walk in. Hello, podcast listeners. It's Paul Carenza here. Welcome to the British Broadcasting Century podcast. It's been a while, hasn't it? We've had a minor gap since Christmas, but on this episode, I thought we'd start a new season with a books special. And I'm in Oxford because I'm heading now to the Listen In exhibition, How Radio Changed the Home, part of the Bodleian Library. I'm off to the Western Library, actually. Oxford's full of libraries. And Beaty Rubens has put together this exhibition based on a couple of notebooks on listener research. So in a break from our regular timeline on the podcast, which will resume next episode, this time we're going to have a series of different authors bringing their different takes on broadcasting history to the page. Books, old and new. It's the British Broadcasting Century. Oxford's chilly.
Hello. This is Paul Carenza calling. This is
Oxford. Hello. Welcome to the British Broadcasting Century podcast from chilly Oxford, on location, on tour. This episode, books, old and new. We have many different experts and authors we've been interviewing over the past few years, really. Some guests you've heard before on the podcast and some haven't. So let's start the ball rolling this time with a familiar voice you'll have heard on Radio 4, part of the Today programme, the Sunday programme over the years. Before we meet Beaty Rubens in one of her archives, let's hear about a different archive, the BBC Written Archive Centre, with our first author of many this episode, Ed Sturton.
I find the Caversham archives utterly fascinating. Partly because, a lot of places now are digitised, and you type in what you want and you find it. They aren't, and so you say, well, I'd like everything on, I don't know, censorship in the summer of 1940. And somebody appears with a great bundle of papers, and some of it might be complete dross. Some of it is a letter from Churchill to the Director General. It's just sort of a complete mixture, and you have a real sense of discovery going through it. And I suspect there are all sorts of hidden treasures there. We haven't even, there's just a huge amount to find out. Some of it's also been put together by people with a sense of humour. There's, I looked at the file of some of the war correspondence, and one of them's personnel file has a note from Stores complaining that he failed to give back his stopwatch when he left the OB department and became a reporter. Why is someone who's done that? Then look at the date and you realise that Stores sent him this memo on the day that he entered Rome with the victorious Americans. And at the bottom it says, very good to hear lots of you on the wireless at the moment. Because some bloke sitting in a basement trying to get his stopwatch back while the rest of the world is engaged in this great adventure.
I was down there for the very start of the year for a day, and it was my first time there, just researching for the podcast, and it was like a theme park for me. It was a wonderful place to be, and holding my hand the piece of paper that named the BBC for the first time, and things like that.
Oh,
it was
great.
Wonderful.
Yeah. I found one thing which I sort of almost think of going back to investigate further, because I was looking at a file on house style, and it was full of broadcast examples which people had cited, this was good or this was bad. But one of the broadcasts was an account of what it was like in Auschwitz, written by a Pole who had been a prisoner there. Now, it was before it became a death camp, 1940, 1941 perhaps. But I didn't know that we even knew Auschwitz was, there at that stage, let alone that we were broadcasting first-hand accounts of what it was like being inside. And I think it's full of treasures like that, which one, you want to follow up and find out more about.
Edward Sturton, who joined us previously on the podcast to talk about his book Auntie's War. That sent him deep into the archives, including the BBC Written Archive Centre in Caversham. So this episode, we're bringing you various authors, but particularly I wanted to focus on our next one. To Oxford now, which is host of the Marconi Archives. And the Bodleian Library, based out of Western Library, in fact, has this marvellous exhibition based on some diaries found there. Listen In, How Radio Changed the Home is the name of the exhibition, and also the name of the accompanying book, which I can highly recommend. I have a copy in front of me now. It's a marvellous doorstep of a book packed with information, and it's by Beaty Rubens. Delighted to welcome to the podcast now a former BBC radio producer for 35 years at the BBC, making documentaries and arts, but a writer, enthusiast, exhibition curator, author of the new book Listen In, How Radio Changed the Home, and the marvellous exhibition here in Oxford, from where we speak. Beaty Rubens, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very
on the
much.
Podcast. I've just had a look around your wonderful exhibition. It's on till the end of August 2025. We should state that because podcasts will last and last and last. It's a delight, isn't it? It's a wonderful exhibition. Tell us about how you've come to put this on here.
Well, for 35 years I was a radio producer, so I thought a lot about how my programmes landed in people's homes, but actually its origins were much closer to home for me, if you like. My father was born in 1910, but my mother was born in 1923, and sadly, long after they died, I began to think of the difference between being a pre-wireless child and a child growing up with the wireless. We'd say today, wouldn't we, a wireless native, like we say, a digital native. Yes. So that really got me going, thinking about the listener experience. And then I looked round and I realised, and I don't have to tell you this, there is masses and masses and masses written about broadcasting, but very little indeed on what it was like for ordinary people, our grandparents or parents, to welcome this new technology into the home. And you have to remember, it's the first form of home-based mass entertainment. So now we take radio for granted, but then it was new and it was exciting and it was, people would say today, wouldn't they, disruptive. So then I live near Oxford and I had recently left the BBC, and I went to Bodleian Libraries and said I thought it would make a very special book and exhibition, because I knew what precious archive there is here in the Bodleian, in particular the Marconi Archive and a wonderful, slightly bonkers archive called the John Johnson Archive of Printed Ephemera. And that is an archive of amazing early magazines and brochures and so on. And I knew that I could bring together all of this material and make, with the help of the teams here, something really special that would speak to people.
Well, and you have, the exhibition has just opened. The book is out today as we speak, which is fantastic. And I've got literally a copy in front of me now. You can hear, this is an audio podcast, but you can hear the pages. Isn't that marvellous? And the exhibition was great. And walking around it with you, I've never had a tour by the curator as well, but seeing everyday people who were just there looking around and enthusiastic about it, and maybe some who knew a little about it, some who knew a lot, some who knew nothing whatsoever. But it's really evocative as well, because especially something which is about audio, what you've got there is that visual, the look of how things felt, and the lovely Art Deco look of the designs, and then also this wonderful angle on the listener experience particularly.
Yes, I mean, the great challenge in a way was that some of the most beautiful material is fundamentally promotional material. So now we might take these things for granted, but you know, the BBC was a tech startup in 1922, and it needed to be sure that people were going to go for the new technology. The manufacturers wanted to sell the gadgets, so there's a lot of promotional material which is colourful and beautiful, but it doesn't necessarily give us the proper nitty-gritty of what it's like to welcome a new technology into the home. As today, I don't know what it's like in your home, but you know, we shout a lot at our smart TV because we can't get it to work.
That's about right,
and there were absolute equivalents then. So what we've really tried to do is get the kind of promotional narrative and then a kind of counter-narrative of what it was really like.
Yeah, and those listener experiences can be often hard to find in the very early days, I guess, because the BBC nowadays, we know, of course, they listen. And there are surveys and polls and focus groups, and I think they came in officially, you know, after some time, but the very early days, not a lot, is there?
No, I mean, it's perhaps not the proudest moment of Sir John Reith, who was the first Director General, and, you know, fabulous in all sorts of ways, but he was firmly of the opinion that he would tell the listeners what they thought. And honestly, he would tell them how to listen, and he would tell them what to do and what not to do. And it was only in the 1930s when the BBC began to feel the heat from the continental commercial rivals, Normandy, Luxembourg, that they began to realise that they needed to do some audience research. So there's a smattering of early testimony about listening. But until the listener research, there isn't so much. And it was a very exciting discovery I made in the Bodleian Archive that's expanded our first-person testimony of what it was like for ordinary people to listen.
Well, tell us about that then. So, and also not just what you found, but the experience of finding it as well.
Honestly, I was so overexcited. I had to go down to the cafe and buy a very strong coffee and a large piece of carrot cake because I couldn't quite believe I was finding what I was finding. It was so exciting. I should say that material in the Bodleian is really, really well indexed. So it wasn't quite like something that had been that was buried treasure, if you like. But the key thing was when one of these early bits of audience research was done, it was done by two women down in Bristol called Winifred Gill and Hilda Jennings. And I knew that Winifred Gill's archive was held here in the Bodleian because it contains a lot of other things. And I wanted to see this very early pamphlet that they had done the research for and written called Broadcasting in Everyday Life, a Survey of the Impact of Broadcasting, slightly wordy title. And I wanted actually to see the pamphlet that they had written and that was published on the eve of war. I knew about it, but there are very few copies, so I ordered it up and it came in a beautiful acid-free, dove grey special archive box. And I opened the box and there was the lovely red, it's just a pamphlet, red BBC publication, 2 shillings it cost. And I lifted it out. And under the pamphlet were 2 handwritten notebooks, field notebooks really, in which it was apparent immediately a lot of the field research had been done. In other words, when they went door to door, house to house, doing this research, and then a notebook that's a bit more like a fair copy notebook, in which some of the best bits or the most interesting bits, significant bits have been copied in beautiful green ink. You've seen it in seen it in the gallery. Yeah. I cross-checked between the published pamphlet and the notebooks, and it quickly became apparent that there was far more material than had ever been published.
Yeah. And the fact that obviously at the time they think, we can't include all this, we'll trim it down. But for now, looking back, it's golden to find. There's so little we can find about that stuff. So
exactly, and it not only has some stories that haven't been told before, but miles more colour, if you like. So you really get an impression of how people felt, for example, about listening to sport. Boxing on the radio became a big thing, and it was hugely popular. But you get a great variety of feelings. Some people really hate it, understandably, I think. I'm not a big fan of it. Yeah. But equally, you get people talking about the way the broadcasting of classical music has expanded their interest. So you get somebody who says, oh yes, I'm much more interested now in Wagner or Handel's Messiah or Sibelius. And then you get other voices that say, I like Gracie Fields myself. Right, okay. So you get, it's like the experience of the listener is brought to life, and it's sort of polyphonic, a polyphonic account of the arrival of radio in an area. It's a working class area of Bristol, about 800 households. Okay. So it's just been thrilling to find it.
Okay, so they've been these 2 women have gone door to door. It's late 30s then?
Yes, exactly.
And so as you say, go to 10 years before that, John Reith is very much, we'll wag our finger at you and tell you what we think you deserve to listen.
Exactly.
You don't know what's best for you, we do. And I suppose also it's easy to take for granted back then that they didn't have as much choice as we do nowadays. It's not like you could keep flipping channels to a variety of things. So you turn it on, you hear what the BBC is providing for you, and you have an opinion about it, I suppose.
That's exactly right. I mean, in some way, it's very unifying in a way, because if you're listening in Land's End, that probably the person listening in John O'Groats is listening to the same thing. There is a certain amount of dial twiddling, and so, for example, if you want music, you might get a concert from Paris or Hilversum or somewhere. But generally, people are listening to the same thing at the same time.
And in the exhibition then, so you've brought this to life. I've been over and you've heard, we've got actors voicing elements of this as well. Again, it's just a lovely opportunity to explore that, and the fact that people can walk around. And those who can make the exhibition, we would urge them to come to. So it's the Western Library, isn't it?
That's right, which is part of the Bodleian Libraries, and it's in the Broad Street, right in the heart of Oxford, and it's free.
And it's free.
Yeah.
Amazing. So, I mean, Oxford is a beautiful place anyway. So if you've not been, you've got to come to Oxford for that. But come for that between now and August.
August 31st.
And if you can't make it to Oxford, and even if you can, the book as well has more information than on those things.
So the book is not just a kind of take-home version of the exhibition. It's not a catalogue. It's a proper book in which I've tried to tell the story chronologically, but also tease out some of the issues. So, for example, what was during the day, the vast majority of listeners were women, housewives at home. So what was it like for them? What did it do for them or fail to do for them? Did it revolutionise their lives or did it just enrich their lives? And I've looked at issues of politics and class, for example, and of the way that BBC News increasingly became seen as more reliable than the newspapers. There's a wonderful interviewee who says that she used to read the newspapers, but now she trusts the news. She says it's more reliable. They wouldn't tell lies out loud for everyone to hear.
Oh, interesting.
And so, as you know, this is all very much in the run-up to the beginning of the Second World War, and you begin to get, in the final chapter, I talk about the way that the unifying of the nation, I don't want to over-idealise it, but the unifying of the nation through news and comedy and sport is a very good preparation for the onslaught of war and the sense of a single nation holding out against the enemy.
We clearly love the history of it, of course, but I'm constantly trying to tell people as well that this informs today then, because so much of what you're saying there about people they wouldn't dare say lies out loud, and then you compare some people nowadays not trusting mainstream media and finding their own sources.
Absolutely.
A troubled world today, it informs where we're at, doesn't it?
You're so right. And the interesting thing is I've been working on this exhibition, since 2021, but with the Bodleian, we've been working on it for the last 18 months. And some of the cartoons in particular, they've come in and out of sort of relevance, if you like. And now, in this very frightening and uncertain world we're living in, where I think I'm not alone sometimes in saying, I just don't want the news on. It's too upsetting, too distressing, too worrying. There's a cartoon that I'd never properly looked at before of a man sitting by his wireless set in the evening listening to the news, and in the cartoon the words of the news come out like a halo around the news, and it's Mussolini, it's Hitler, it's all of the worrying things that were happening in 1939, and the man who's listening is reaching for the poker because he is about to smash the radio, because he says, I don't want more news. And I think that that's very topical today, a feeling that people it's just too much. Yeah. But the other thing also connected with that, I think, is the way that radio in this period did unify listeners, and people were listening to the same thing, and they might disagree, but they were talking about the same thing, whereas I think I'm not alone in my anxiety about the fragmentation of the delivery of news and an undermining of the idea of truth and reliability of a kind that I think was stronger then than it is perhaps today.
Well, on that downbeat note, but it goes to show it informs where we're at now, and it's a delight. I would really recommend anyone listening get to the exhibition here in Oxford. So it's Listen In: How Radio Changed the Home.
Yep.
If you put that into your search engine of choice, you can Google it, you can ask Jeeves, you can look on CFAX, whatever it might be.
Whatever you like, and the book you can buy from any good bookshop.
Any good bookshop, exactly. Get out there. And so, Beaty Rubens, thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations on your marvellous exhibition.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Get it now. I've had plenty of correspondence about books old and new from podcast listeners, some of whom have actually published books of their own that it would be rude of us not to mention and indeed encourage you to get. And there are so few books about broadcasting history that when a great one comes out, you need to know about it here. An email from Alan Stafford, the comedy historian. Alan was talking about an episode we did a couple of times ago, the wireless manhunt of 1923. And a little bit I didn't realise about this, but 6 days after the 1923 wireless manhunt, which you may remember, sent broadcasters from London 2LO all around the capital and beyond it, and listeners had to try and catch them, basically. A little bit like the Radio 1's giant DJ hunt that Greg James has done in more recent years. Well, the 1923 one was followed 6 days later by a spoof of it. Alan Stafford is the biographer of the comedian John Henry, the first radio comedian in Britain, really. And Alan's new book is called Bigamy Killed the Radio Star, a brilliant book. And Alan says that John Henry was on London 2LO with a piece called John Henry's Manhunt. So this is just a week after the proper manhunt, which Arthur Burrows and Uncle Jeff and Aunt Sophie were all chasing around the capital. Not quite sure what the content of John Henry's manhunt was, but we know that John Henry's wireless elephant was another example of John Henry wanting to spoof the more serious things that the BBC was doing. I love the idea that really early on you get the BBC trying to be both serious but also willing to mock itself at the same time. I mean, that's something that really came in from even before John Henry and Peter Eckersley, the chief engineer, who, before he was chief engineer, was on 2MT Riddle mocking what London 2LO were doing. Anyway, we could pull on that thread and go back further and further. But do get Alan's book, Bigamy Killed the Radio Star, available now from Phantom Publishing. Link in the show notes to that and all of the books that we talk about this episode. Someone who's written about Peter Eckersley himself. Let's hear from the Marconi historian and author of 2MT Riddle and countless other books on early radio, Tim Wonder, on what Peter Eckersley did next.
The other thing about Eckersley in the early 1930s is that Eckersley is squeezed out. He comes up with a lot of ideas because he is a man of ideas for systems that will compete against the BBC. He really believes that there are systems using 100 years, 70 years ahead of his time. So he gave this famous paper in 1932 where he imagined sitting in an armchair with buttons on the arm, looking at a big screen on the wall, able to select whatever radio station and television station, even to watch live sport with the press of the button. Eckersley in 1932. I mean, it is quite phenomenal when you read it. It's basically, it would have been science fiction then in terms of technology, but this is where he wanted to go. He was looking at using the railway lines to transmit radio, and in fact, the system actually operated in Hull. He formed a company called Rediffusion. Some of your listeners might remember that as one of the TV rental companies. Rediffusion, called Broadcasting Again, was his name. Eckersley came up with the name. He was a director of the company. But the BBC goes out of its way, bless them, to squash it, to basically say you can't do it. He looks at transmitting from Guernsey and the Isle of Sark to put an independent voice across, because there's nothing. The BBC dominates the British airwaves. So Eckersley is really bitter. It comes out quite clearly as he writes and rails against what the BBC is doing. But he also is a passionate believer in free speech, a passionate believer that really there should be some fun in radio, some comedy, some amusement. And the BBC is still dominated by Reith, and the broadcasters will use pronounced English and they'll wear dinner jackets and have a red carnation in their collar. Maybe that's not a bad thing, but that's where we go.
Thank you, Tim. That man knows more than pretty much anyone on the planet about early British broadcasting. Loving your work, Tim. Tim Wonder's books are available. We'll put the link in the show notes. 2MT Riddle is a marvellous one. And From Marconi to Melba is one of my favourites. Very glossy visual book as well. While we're doing those who know pretty much everything about British broadcasting, let's have two authors now who both had books out for the centenary of the BBC. In a moment, the author of This is the BBC, Entertaining the Nation, Speaking for Britain 1922 to 2022. That's Professor Simon J. Potter of the University of Bristol, Professor of Modern History there. The voice we'll hear from first is the author of BBC A People's History, by Emeritus Professor in Media and Cultural History at University of Sussex, Professor David Hendy.
This is an institution that grows and grows and grows, and it becomes eventually tens of thousands of people working for it, and it becomes professionalised, and it has its routines. To some extent, of course, individual people cannot shape the whole of the BBC. But actually, still they make a difference. And actually, still, I think we need to think of, especially in the early days, it's not just that there are fewer people and therefore, because there are fewer people there, they can make an individual difference. It's that there were no rules, really. Reith says, I can't remember his exact words, you no doubt will know, but he says there were no sealed orders to open.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
So they invent for themselves what broadcasting is, and they do bring their personalities and their individuality to it. Cecil Lewis, for instance, deputy director of programs, very young man in 1922. He's just 24 years old, I think. And we know he was a fighter pilot in the First World War when still a teenager. And, he was exhilarated by flying and the wartime for much of the time. That sense of the machinery, the technology of flying, being aloft, looking down, the sense of purpose, the sense of mission. And of course, the more he looks down, the more over time he becomes rather despairing at what he's seeing below on the Western Front. The trenches, the destruction, nothing changing, month after month, but people dying. And he comes out of the war, looking for some way in which humanity can redeem itself and stop sliding towards barbarism, if you like. And for him, it was probably going to be art and poetry and music and or something like that. He wasn't quite sure how this would work. And when he does join the BBC, he's actually very clear that for him, there shouldn't be very much news. That's not what the BBC was for. It should be entertainment. He says in one of his memoirs, we just had our fill of kind of what was happening in the world. We wanted to escape from it for a while. And so that feeds into the schedule of the early BBC, so, and of course there are other reasons. This is where the external reasons come in as well. The newspapers didn't really want the BBC to get into the business of news, so there were heavy restrictions on what the BBC could do in terms of news. But it wasn't just those external forces, it was also the individual personalities who thought of radio as something that could nurture what a later Director General, I think it was William Haley, said, that the aim was to nurture true citizenship and the leading of a full life. And a leading of a full life wasn't just about virtue. It wasn't just about, keeping up with current events and understanding contemporary debates. It was about rest and relaxation, and the home and the hearth and the wireless was going to be something that would somehow help heal a troubled nation and provide people with rest and relaxation, as well as giving them access to, that famous Reithian quote, the best that has been thought and said and done. So yes, people, those early pioneers, the Cecil Lewises and the Arthur Burrows and the Jeffreys and the Val Gielguds and Hilda Mathesons, they're all trying to work out, what can we as individuals with our contact books and our ideas bring to this terrifying thing, which is the empty grid of a schedule. It's filling.
So that was David Hendy, whose book The BBC A People's History was out in 2022, the same time that This Is the BBC was out by this man, Simon J. Potter.
I tried to do something that was critical rather than a celebration. That was my aim. There's this sense that the BBC is this force for liberalism, progressive political change and cultural and social change, bringing all the great things into people's lives. And that's definitely true. But at the same time, there's another much less prominent way of writing about the BBC, which sees it as, a very significant agglomeration of power in British society, British politics, British culture, and that power isn't always used for good. And that the BBC's history has involved upholding cultural hierarchies, social hierarchies and inequalities. It hasn't always been a force for liberation. And I think one of the things that, struck me writing about the BBC, particularly when it comes to international broadcasts, which is one of my key areas of interest, is that the BBC has often worked very closely with the British government to secure particularly British foreign policy agendas. So it's an incredibly complex, I think almost chaotic organization. It's very hard to pin it down. There are so many different centers of power, so many different people doing creative things and often trying to frustrate each other and stop each other's agendas functioning. So it's very hard to write about it as a single monolithic organization doing one thing.
We can't go too long without mentioning your book once again, your marvellous book, This is the BBC.
Thank you.
Early on in that, you mentioned about a quote here I've got: over the last century, the BBC has probably been the single most important institution generating British soft power and overseas propaganda. And as you alluded to, sometimes this can be, it's not positive or negative propaganda, but it is propaganda indeed. And in fact, I remember I was driving, I went to a media history conference, and I could only arrive halfway through, and you were presenting, I believe it was, at the very early bit. And thanks to the miracle of technology, I could listen to the conference live while driving to it due to the live stream. And I'd just been editing a podcast episode about World War II propaganda. And you were then on this, as I was driving, I heard you talk about the fact that essentially the sort of BBC angle on propaganda, this was BBC propaganda in a way in World War II. And we have to acknowledge it as such. And I remember thinking, oh, pants, I need to go quickly and edit my podcast based on what I've just heard you say as I drive to this conference. But can you dwell a little bit on that then? Because those very early days, this is a time of opportunity, and the technology they're just experimenting with it. But as it builds, then this is, I suppose, laying the framework of international broadcasting and how the BBC plants its sort of flag in the world.
I think what's really striking is that, again, I think it's 1925, something is established called the International Broadcasting Union. And it's an organization of effectively all of Europe's big broadcasting organizations. And the BBC plays a leading role in the foundation of the International Broadcasting Union, the IBU. And part of the purpose of that is to regulate regulate broadcasting that's crossing borders. So, the BBC, other broadcasters in Europe are investing in ever more powerful transmitters, and there are so many of them that they're all clashing and causing terrible interference. So one of the reasons that they found this International Broadcasting Union is to try and regulate among themselves how they're going to use the spectrum, the broadcast spectrum. But the other thing that the IBU tries to do is introduce sort of self-denying ordinances about propaganda and an agreement that people won't broadcast aggressive propaganda against other countries in the region. And of course, that becomes increasingly fraught and difficult from 1933 onwards with the Nazi takeover in Germany and the use of radio by the Nazis to not only try and stimulate loyalty among German citizens to the Nazi state, but also to actively subvert, for example, Austria, and to try and bring about civil disorder and unrest in Austria with a view to encouraging a Nazi takeover there. So in the mid-1930s, the BBC gets drawn into all of these discussions among the different broadcasters, but also with the British government about the rising use of radio for overt propaganda purposes. I think what's quite interesting is that the British Foreign Office, when you look at the British official archives, the British Foreign Office is quite happy to use the word propaganda to describe what the BBC does.
Right.
BBC officers never use that word. Almost never will a BBC member of staff describe what the BBC is doing as propaganda. And I think that is, one of the great assets that Britain has in the late 30s and in the Second World War and then into the Cold War, that the BBC is doing what we might call soft power work, cultural diplomacy, but what is clearly also propaganda broadcasting, is doing all of this in a very close relationship with British civil servants in the Foreign Office, the Colonial Office, other sections of the British government. But all the time, it's claiming that it's objective, that it is broadcasting the truth, that it is not under direct state control. And it's very seldom that sort of officials push on the BBC the idea that it has to do something, because they know that having the BBC there as this seemingly independent, truthful voice is of huge benefit to Britain internationally, and is a fantastic tool of propaganda, particularly when at key moments the British state also has access to other much more heavy-handed forms of propaganda. So I think during the Second World War, yes, the BBC is, notionally at least still independent, but at the same time, the British government has access to all sorts of other forms of propaganda, including radio stations that are directly controlled by the government, which can do all the nasty stuff, all of the, the subversive, lying and misleading propaganda. So the BBC is sort of one tool in the armory of the British state when it comes to international propaganda. And because it's only one of those tools, it can be particularly powerful in doing this very subtle, persuasive work.
Now, like I said, we've had correspondence as well as audio guest interviews for you. And here's a book. There you go. It sounds like that. It's called What's in the Air. It's by Jude Montague. And it's so new, it's not even out yet. It's a graphic novel about radio pioneers in Manchester, particularly about how Jude's grandfather met her grandmother. Sidney Wright was the musician with the 2ZY Quartet. And this graphic novel that Jude's put together is all about the origin story of music in Manchester, and indeed the origin story of her own grandparents. I'd read a bit to you, but it's all in the pictures, and you've got to get a copy yourself. It's called What's in the Air. It's by Jude Montague, and it's out later this year. We'll retrospectively put the link in the show notes when that link is available. And more immediately, look out for Jude Montague's exhibition at the Hastings Museum on John Logie Baird. The exhibition's called Transmissions, or the Psycho-Shadowy of John Logie Baird, and Jude's put it together with Geraldine Swain, and it's all about the inventor of television. Hastings Museum, it's on there from January until the end of March 2025. Another guest then, please. Professor Amy Holdsworth is Professor of Television, Film and Cultural Studies at the University of Glasgow. We've had her on the podcast before, but what I've not aired is her opinions growing up of Wogan. Not the man, the TV show, and how that casts a little shadow over her life, plus her tales of TV dinners. This is Amy Holdsworth.
Yeah, and that I write in the book about, it's just a little sort of like anecdote of how much I hated Wogan. But it was always
you normally get so many people going out love of Wogan, but I know this is Wogan the TV show rather than Wogan the person. Yes. But still, It's very rare you hear one nowadays say, I hated Wogan.
It was so boring. All I can remember is greyness. It was obviously the 80s. I was a kid. But it was on at it was on at bedtime, so just before you went to bed. And so that's what's always fascinated me about television, is the way the kind of sounds and colours and textures of television, how they get tied to specific moments in your life and can become reference points for your own kind of biography. So I think it's a really fascinating medium, and the way in which our memories of it are so tied to the home and the family as well.
And so what else is in your book then on living with television?
Well, I think that what I wanted to base the book around was a series of, I suppose, practices or rituals that take place within the home, and how they inform our television consumption, but how our kind of television viewing informs those practices as well. So the first two chapters focus around, caring for children. And the first chapter is quite autobiographical and tells the story of my younger sister, who had something called Rett syndrome. She was quite severely disabled, and it works through the kind of meanings of Disney and Disney home video, and particularly in the kind of late 80s and 90s, and the way in which we used home video in the kind of routines of care, but also how meaningful Disney home video was for Alice and for her life. Then the second chapter moves on to think about the bedtime hour and kind of bedtime rituals, and the way television, that kind of history of BBC preschool television for children at bedtime, It's quite specific. But I think, as I said, it sort of reveals something about those structures of television and the way in which they weave together the kind of institutional with the kind of individual and the domestic. Then there's a chapter about eating with television, which was really fun to write, which was thinking about how we kind of co-consume food and television at the same time and how one can impact on the other. You're eating your dinner with your TV and then something comes on and it just completely puts you off your dinner.
Yeah.
But how does these kind of ordinary affects around how we eat with television and the kind of meanings associated with that?
Wonderful. Well, I can relate to that. My wife and I, we sit down and we watch. We've series linked the news, which I don't know if that's a wise thing to do.
Oh, I'd say that's a very probably
terrible
idea.
thing to do. But partly is because we used to watch the 10 o'clock news at the start of the pandemic. I thought, no, we don't want to go to bed on this. So we series link the 6. But then you don't want to eat your dinner with that. So we do sit down. We are terrible for TV dinners, and but we watch a nice bit of Shakespeare and Hathaway, Father Brown, the daytime TV upgraded to nighttime for us, while having our dinner, because you can never, a nice chili con carne goes down well with Father Brown. That's all I can tell you.
Very good. Maybe we should come up with a book, basically what to eat when you're watching certain theories.
Yes.
What to binge whilst you're binging. Yeah,
that's nice. There you go. It's like it's like the sommeliers who recommend the wine to go with it. We recommend the TV to go with your TV dinner.
Exactly. But obviously it's a great example of, so the broadcast schedule might not have the same kind of power that it used to have, but that's a really good example of how we self-schedule and how those ties between television and our domestic lives are still really, really strong. And I think that's really what the book kind of explores.
The book of Professor Amy Holdsworth is on living with television. Link to that in the show notes. Now, a couple of things I've been sent, I had to mention here on the podcast. One is from Graham Brown, who very kindly sent me a book. It's Frank Muir's autobiography called A Kentish Lad. Thank you, Graham. He saw a copy himself and he just couldn't resist getting me a copy and sending it in the post, which is very kind of him. Here's a little bit. This is the comedy writer Frank Muir joining the BBC. The first time I worked for the BBC, he said, was in 1947 as a performer on television rather than as a writer. I was demobbed by then and had collected my chalk-striped grey flannel suit, not all that bad a fit, a pork pie hat made of stiffish cardboard and a gratuity of £40, all most welcome. The television job was comparing a review celebrating the BBC's 25th anniversary. It starred Claude Hulbert, or Hubert, and according to the front of the script, a leading comedian from the Players Theatre, Olive Dunn. Well, Olive turned out to be a misprint of Clive. Oh, Clive Dunn, there you go. Part of Frank Muir's origin story at the BBC from the book A Kentish Lad, delivered to me very kindly by Graham Brown. Thank you, Graham. Here's another thing I've been sent from Bob Richardson of St Bride's. He sent me a huge bundle, really, of pamphlets of broadcast talks and librettos from the early BBC in the 1920s, 1930s. Oh, a joyous collection there. What I'll do, I'll take a picture and we'll put some on the social media pages of the British Broadcasting Century. You can find us on Twitter/X. You can find us on Facebook. We've got a Facebook group there and a Facebook page. And newly as well, we're on Blue Sky. So if you are a Blue Skyer, do find the British Broadcasting Century there. And I will share there some of these marvellous pictures of Bob's brilliant BBC pamphlets that he's found, saved and sent along. I particularly love the broadcast talks from the 1929-1930 season when they would do these accompanying booklets to show you who's on the air, the subjects they'll talk about. Oh, a thing of beauty. Thank you, Bob. A tiny bit more correspondence before we go from Martin Cooper, academic, broadcaster, listener, and author of Radio's Legacy in Popular Culture. Martin has emailed me a lovely little quote here from Jonah Barrington's And Master of None. It's an autobiography in which he talks about early religious broadcasting. Jonah Barrington was the choir master at Broadcasting House in 1932, and he notes that Sir Edward Elgar, on being shown the glories of the place, as in Broadcasting House, paused a moment in the concert hall, gazed long and earnestly at a magnificent and shining BBC coat of arms emblazoned upon the grille of the casing which was to house but never did the BBC organ, and Elgar said, "I seem to have seen something like that outside a pub," he murmured rosily and passed on. The book continues, the religious studio on the third floor was our especial pride. It was originally to have been consecrated as holy ground by some bishop, but the project was dropped upon the discovery that several floors below lay something outrageously secular, like a canteen or an underground railway. Now, I've heard that the thing below it was the entertainment studio, but I've also heard it was the gents' toilets. Either way, that was why the religious studio was not consecrated at the BBC. Thank you for sending that to us, Martin. And he also notes that actually Jonah Barrington was, in Martin's words, a bit of a rum cove. Turns out Barrington was the pen name he used when he first became the radio critic of the Sunday Express after he left the BBC under a bit of a cloud for relations with a married woman. Martin says apparently he was then the source and the conduit of much Beeb gossip ending up in the papers in the interwar years. And Martin says, I also learned he was the one who later came up with the name Lord Haw-Haw of the propagandist on the German airwaves. The unintended consequence, of course, was this was gold for the headline writers and led to even more people tuning into the German propaganda broadcast. There you go. So who knew that Lord Haw-Haw was a title come up with by Jonah Barrington, the first choirmaster of the BBC? Thank you, Martin Cooper. His book is Radio's Legacy in Popular Culture, and that link will be in the show notes. We'll also put a link to prefadelisten.com, Martin's blog and website. Back in the warmth of my car after my chilly trip around Oxford for the Listen In exhibition, curated by Beaty Rubens, hosted by Bodleian Library. It is a marvel. We mentioned it early on in this episode, but I would implore you and encourage you once again as we close this episode that her book, Listen In, is marvellous. Her exhibition runs until August 2025. I highly commend both of them. Thank you also to the many authors that we've had this episode. I love how some of the points in one interview get picked up in another. So Beaty Rubens talks about the unifying, emboldening voice of the BBC in terms of news in the 1930s and 40s. And we talk about then Ed Sturton and what he discovered about 1940s writing Auntie's War. But then also Simon J. Potter talking about the dangers of a singular funded voice of the BBC, which puts out, in his words, its own form of propaganda. And then David Hendy talking about, before that, Cecil Lewis, that fighter pilot who became the Deputy Director of Programmes at the BBC, flying over the battlefields of World War I and feels such doom from it that all he wanted to bring to the airwaves after that was not news and gloom, but joy and entertainment. Informing, educating and entertaining. Hopefully it's still doing that today. But, yeah, many issues therein with it. We had another half dozen authors recorded, which I was all set to include this episode as well. But I feel I can't do that to your ears and make them flip-flop across the century too many times. So we'll hold them in reserve for future episodes. Many more episodes to come then as we go through this British broadcasting century. Next time, chronologically, at long last, we will immerse you back into August of 1923, I promise you, with Scottish and Irish broadcasting from our guests Graham Stewart and Eddie Bowen. And if you've thought we've had a little gap between our Christmas special, 5 Gold Airings, and this episode, we've had about a month or two off, but we weren't quite on Patreon. So if you follow us on patreon.com/Paul Carenza, it's £5 a month. You cancel anytime. I've put out 3 or 4 different videos and recordings, including a reading from Cecil Lewis's book, Broadcasting from Within, that fighter pilot who was flying over those battlefields. He wrote the first book on broadcasting. We're reading it bit by bit on Patreon. We also had a Peter Eckersley special in his own words, and we looked through some 1935 cigarette cards with pictures of Broadcasting House. No cigarettes were required to bring you those cigarette cards. All of those visual and audio delights are there on Patreon for our patrons. So thank you if you support us on that. We've not been quite there, even though we have been here on this podcast. But now we're back in a new season. Stay subscribed, rate, review us if you like this podcast. And thanks once again to all of the authors. The details of them are in the show notes. And all that remains to say is...
The British Broadcasting Century is presented and produced by Paul Carenza. Original music is by Will Farmer. Nothing to do with the BBC of the present day whatsoever. It's talking about the old Beeb and not the current one.
And do join us next time for the tale of August 1923 on the BBC, but also off the BBC, as we discover Ireland's first broadcast as well, from Dublin. And that's not BBC, is it? But it is Marconi. That's next time on the British, and indeed Irish, Broadcasting Century.